Apocalypse Now from 1979. The IMDb plot summary: A U.S. Army officer serving in Vietnam is tasked with assassinating a renegade special forces colonel who sees himself as a god. So co-written and directed by Coppola, starring Martin Sheen, Marlon Brando, and Robert Duvall, and Dennis Hopper. We'll say Harrison Ford too is in this as well.
Right.
And Scott Glenn too, a young Scott Glenn. A lot of people in this actually. So this was the a movie that I'd known about, much like The Godfather, growing up as this adult, like ultimate war movie was always sort of what it was in my head. And I didn't come to this until I was in my late teens and decided, okay, I think I'm ready to check out what this movie is because I'd heard so much about it, and all of it was just praise. Like every adult was like, "Oh, this is the best war movie ever. Oh, this is the most incredible movie ever." So I did have really high expectation to it going in. And I remember my first impressions of it were that, wow, this is just such a big movie with a lot going on. And I remembered liking it, though not loving it because at the time, like to me, war movies I wanted to be super realistic, and this definitely was not one. This is not meant to show you what it was like to fight in the Vietnam War. Like I was a lot more into like, oh, Platoon and like I want to know what it was like kind of thing. And I sort of docked it a little bit of points for that. I didn't appreciate or understand the surrealist elements that this movie brings in and what it actually really is about, which is the heart of darkness inside every human is sort of what it's
Mhm.
trying to do, and not say, oh, the Vietnam War sucked, which is sort of the types of movies that I was enjoying more at the time. So I've seen it multiple times since then. I think now it is one of my favorite movies, and I think one of the top 10 best movies ever made in terms of what it can pull off. And the closest sort of analogy to this in terms of another movie to me is 2001, where that movie also it's like a journey and a trip you're going on. It's an experience. It's not only just the movie. And
Mhm.
this movie is also an experience. It isn't just a movie. It's like, I mean, I've never taken LSD, but I would imagine it's like going on an acid trip, but an acid trip into darkness as opposed to 2001, which is more like about sort of the hope and the future of humanity. And this is definitely horrible creatures
Mhm.
who do horrible things. But I'll talk more about it because there's so much to discuss in this film. But when did you first see this movie, and what are your impressions of it?
Yeah, I avoided this movie for the longest time, so I finally watched it last week for this podcast because I just had heard
Oh,
great things,
cool.
but also that it's a tough watch and it's an experience, like you said, and you need to dedicate time and what have you for it, and that's why I kept avoiding it. But I was blown away, like you said, like this movie from the very moment it starts, like not just a journey and experience. It is that, but it's a bit of a fever dream, kind of
Hmm.
what you're saying with if somebody was on an acid trip. Obviously, technically, and the way it's mounted, the way it looks and feels, is you're totally transported. But also, what it ends up communicating about humanity and what we are capable of and the dark side, it shows it, but it's sort of more felt,
Hmm.
like it's not a war movie in the sense that, oh, we're going to show all the evils of war and make a statement. It sort of feels a lot more in the head, if you will, to the point that after watching the movie, I almost was like, was this even real? Like, did this even happen? Did Martin Sheen even go there? Or is Brando's cave even a thing? Like it just has this quality to it. And of course, it's the crafts across the board, it's the performances, but also I think there's something about the narrative device of the movie, which is Martin Sheen's voice kind
Hmm.
of telling us about what is happening and how he's learning about Brando and the letters and the research, and he's also this kind of numb person who's probably not right in his head because already he's been back, and that's how the movie starts. Like you're in his point of view, so it's that classic kind of unreliable narrator sort of thing that's going
Hmm.
on, but then you're also there yourself. So it's a trip, in all sense of the word, and you're on this journey. And but you're right, at the end of it, you just sort of, it's a very dark movie. You're wowed by it, but you're also in the deep hole of realizing what we are capable of,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter really. I say this with caution because obviously this happened. There are real people who had a terrible time. So many lives were lost. And I understand the criticisms of it doesn't display things with accuracy, but I don't think it's going for that. You
Right.
know,
It's not. Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't matter. I'll be the one to say and get hate for it that it doesn't matter actually, because this is not a documentary. It's a movie that's that has a take on what happened more from like a human point of view.
Right. I think it's trying to capture the emotion of what it
Right.
feels like to descend into your own madness and your own dark side. I mean, it's
Right.
the war brings out the worst in people. I mean, you're killing other human beings for
Exactly.
somebody else, and that obviously can drive you crazy in many ways. And I think that's what a lot of Brando's character is realizing that. You know, the whole a lot of that narration is always this great guy and he's a good family man and everything's great and like what happened to him. And I think because he saw the darkness of what war can bring out, he goes crazy. And I think that is also what, as an audience, you're kind of going through that same journey too. Like you said, it's not spelling things out or showing a lot necessarily, like putting a spotlight on it. It'll do it in really kind of subtle ways. I mean, there's that amazing sequence, obviously, of Robert Duvall where he's trying to clear the beach so they can go surfing, and you see
Mm.
him talking in the foreground to the soldiers, oh, talking about the surf, oh, you the surfing guy or whatever, and then just in the background you see all these Vietnamese villagers just getting lined up by the troops and killed and put away and all this stuff. It's like the horrors of everything is just going around in the background, but the movie's not necessarily focusing on that. It's there and you can see it, and it's just the callousness, the way the movie's even treating that sometimes is what also makes it so horrific. Like these awful things are
I
going on
agree.
all around, but the movie's not really showing you that because it's not about that. It's about what these characters do, but it's all there. And I think that is also adds to the effect as an audience member in terms of what this movie does to you. Because even though it deals with a lot of dark things, I don't want to say like an enjoyable experience, but I like coming back to this movie. Whereas other movies, I know we talked about them sometimes on the podcast where they're just too nihilistic for me, and I just can't even enjoy. Sounds weird, but I can't even sit through the movie and have such an
Hmm.
adverse reaction. This movie is so mesmerizing in a
Right.
weird kind of like calming way, kind of, even though these are like the darkest parts of what humans can do. It's a lot of that is due to, said, the voiceover, also the cinematography by Vito Storaro is some of the best like I've ever seen,
Unbelievable.
especially towards the end when you're coming into Marlon Brando's tribe and the temples and just it's unbelievable. It just sucks you in that way, but it's also kind of calming in this weird. It's like yeah, you feel like you're on drugs or something.
That's the thing. It's a field trip kind of movie. But also like to what you're saying earlier, like Brando is sort of in that character we're seeing this is kind of the darkest side of where you could go to.
Hmm.
But everybody's on that journey,
Yes.
actually,
Hmm.
from the very beginning. Everybody is sort of numb and the callousness of what's happening. And it's subtle in that sense. But it's also kind of real while being surrealistic. I kept imagining that, okay, if these people have been away from home, they've been doing this, they didn't want to be there in the first place, they've
Right.
been living this way, what they're eating, what they're drinking, what have you, you will sort of then start to make light of whatever you're doing. And it's not just like the dark side in you, but just the numb side in you, which numbness can lead to joy in a weird
Hmm.
way as well. It's all kind of interwoven, and you see that with all these people without it being spelled out. And
Right.
in some ways, to your point of like it's a calming experience, I don't know if they intended it to be this way, but the audience is also kind of culpable. They're part of watching this.
Right.
The fact that you can enjoy it in a way and kind of just lay back and relax, it sort of intentionally or unintentionally makes the point that, oh yeah, you're also now callous, because we all have that dark side in us, or we all
Right.
have that numb side in us that kind of gets turned on when you're watching this movie. So it's deeper because of that, I think.
Absolutely. In the same way that I think what this movie is saying too is we all have this darkness in us, but it's the conditions around us, our material conditions that bring that out. And war is
Yeah.
one of those things that bring out the worst in humanity. And as an audience member too, the conditions of watching this movie sort of bring out your numbness in the same way. So I totally agree. I think that definitely works. And just the way that, again, the movie just there's no credits in the beginning or the end of
Mm-hmm.
this movie. There was some, I can't remember how he got this. There was some fight he had to do to get so there's no one's get. Oh, I know. I remember what it was now. When this movie first came out, they handed out paper credits to the audience members in the theater to get
Huh.
around the fact that the unions were like, you have to credit all the people that worked on this. And he didn't want to put it in the movie at all because that would ruin the trip and the experience of making it feel artificial in some way instead of just diving right into that. The
Mm.
brilliant use of the Doors song. I mean, I think
Oh,
one of the
amazing.
best uses of a song in any movie is the beginning and also the end. the end, not a pun, because the use of the song
Yeah.
the end, but at the end of the movie and the end at the beginning of the movie, just absolutely incredible. But just the fact that it ends at the end and there isn't a credit sequence, just
Yeah.
again makes it feel a lot more like some sort of acid trip or an experience and not even a movie. It does live up to the hype, I think. At least it did for me when I first watched
I
it, of
totally did.
something that is just unlike anything else you've ever seen. And I don't think a movie ever can be made like this again. I mean, you mentioned this in the opening, but there's a brilliant documentary by Coppola's wife, it's Heart of Darkness. I think it's Heart of
Yeah,
Darkness,
something like that.
which I don't know if you've seen that. You should watch it
Yeah.
now that you've seen the
Yeah.
film. It's just insane. What I mean, there's like a 3 year process of filming this movie. They were using the real Filipino military that during shoots had to go off and fight a real war. So that sometimes they'd lose the helicopters because they'd have to go off and do something else. I mean, this movie will never get made in the same way again. The scale of this, I mean, with the Ride of the Valkyrie sequence, all those
Right.
helicopters and all those explosions. I mean, everything had to be done practically. And that too, when I'm watching this, I'm just like just in awe of the production, which elevates it even more in my mind. I mean, this is definitely a it's a trip. Like to go back to
Yeah.
that analogy again too. Oh, I also will note as well, he's recut this movie several times over the years, which is something that he's done a lot. And I think actually he's really bad at recutting his films. I saw Apocalypse Now Redux when it came out in the theaters in like 2001 or whatever. I just don't think it's as good, and the final cut isn't as good. Coppola keeps messing with his works, and I think the originals are always the best. That's just my personal opinion. Hopefully, you saw the original version when
I
you.
saw the original,
Okay,
yeah. And
yeah.
I've heard that too. At like they brought in a lot of like history and such and
Hmm.
more backstory, and you don't need that. It sort of
No.
takes away from the trip fever dream part of this. But going back to the documentary, I do want to watch that. But again, from what I've heard and read, like there's innovation, there's genius, and this commitment, and will do anything and whatever it takes to kind of get this done. At the same time, a lot of ego too, and
Yes.
like there's cheating and putting your family and your wife and your own life and everything on the line. There's a lot about him, I think it seems, that comes through from this whole experience, which I'm excited to kind of dive into more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He says it's sort of what the movie's about. He'll become that at that time. And in
Mm,
this movie, he said
gosh.
it. He felt like he was Colonel Kurtz in terms of going mad in his own journey of obsession in the jungle over 3 years. And I mean, it almost killed him. And I mean, it would have bankrupted him if this movie wasn't as successful as it was. That happens on his next movie that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this movie is, I mean, what more can you say to your point you mentioned earlier in the episode? I mean, this is one of the greatest movies ever made and continues to. Every time I see it, I love it even more for different ways.
It's incredible. I mean, the fact that it came together and exists is sort of a miracle, you
I
know.
know.
um
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Hi there, it's Alex. If you like the review and discussion Karan and I just had, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Movies That Shaped Us, to get full episodes. Every other Wednesday, Karan and I review a new release and then discuss 6 other movies made by that film's actor or director and how they shaped us. Subscribe right now or follow our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts via the link in the description below. Hope you join us for the journey.